Ladies and gentlemen, welcome at the side event of COP27, Net Zero in a New Reality, 1 year after GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. This event is very topical and you're in the right place to be, because the geopolitical and macroeconomic situation has changed significantly, as we all know, since European banks began making net zero commitments. COVID-19 pandemic, but also the war in Ukraine, have altered the current operating environment. The new reality poses significant questions for net zero strategy of banks and their clients. Does that mean that we are less committed? Absolutely not. But that does mean that we need to discuss how to implement the plans that we have, because the time of implementation is now. So how is this current situation impacting the implementation of the transition plans? Is short-term noise distracting the banks from the real goal that we're all united to? Or can banks stay on track and deliver their net zero commitments? Looking at these important questions, the European Bank Federation and EY conducted a survey of 27 major European banks from 18 jurisdictions. And today, we are launching our report that summarizes our key findings. You can download this report at EBF and at EY websites, both. In today's joint event with the French Bank Federation, we will be sharing insights from the report and discuss with our excellent panelists the current geopolitics and macroeconomics on the transition of net zero. We will also share our experience and explore progress made with net zero transition programs 1 year after GFANZ. But before going into the panel and discussing with industry leaders, I would like to give the floor to Tony Agotta from the Cabinet of Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, to share his insights and reflections on the impact of current events on our common goals and how he sees the progress since our last COP in Glasgow. Tony is, of course, a senior diplomatic advisor and has a long diplomatic career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also in Brussels and beyond. So I'm extremely happy to have you here online, Tony. And please set the scene for us and tell us where we will go. Well, you've told us where we will go, but how to get there. Tony, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Wim. And I'd like to thank the European Banking Federation and the French Banking Federation for inviting me. I'm a bit self-conscious amongst bankers. We're probably smarter and doing a lot already, but it's an honor. And Executive Vice President Timmermans told me to say hi. We're still in Brussels. We're going to go to COP on Sunday for the second week. Well, my main message here is that I'm here to tell you that we are ebullient in our mission, and that the EU is staying the course, despite the many challenges, or perhaps even because of the many challenges we face. And we feel there are moments in history when the paradigms are shifting, and when they shift, it is rough. And this is one of those moments. There are disruptive forces, as you said, Wim. There are geopolitics, demographic change, the industrial revolution that is going to change everything for everyone. There's the climate and environmental crisis that are truly existential. And more specifically, of course, we've experienced the pandemic, then the war, and the fact that we have new forces and powers in the world, and the global system seems to be upended. We're dealing with an energy crisis, with food challenges, food crisis, pushing towards decoupling of supply lines, putting stress also on democracy, and perhaps even risking a divide in the world. So there's a lot going on. But notwithstanding all of this, and I want to say it again, the EU is staying the course. We put on the table Fit for 55 legislation last year, which was bold because for the first time, we didn't wait for the rest of the world. We went forward and trailblazed with 13 legislative proposals, and they are now in negotiation between Parliament and Council. And if we get all of this, I would like to say that when we say at least 55%, we'd probably get even over that. And we're getting first results. We just already agreed on 2035 for zero emission cars, and we're going further yesterday, effort sharing regulation, and there's a lot more coming. I think it's also important for the narrative because people sometimes misrepresent what's going on with our response to the energy crisis. We call it Repower EU, and it has three legs, and it's very important. The first one is yes, in the short term, to diversify and look for fossil fuel like gas so we can stay afloat. But that's for the short term. At the same time, we are increasing our efficiency targets tremendously, and we're also doubling down on our clean energy transition. So we're doing all the same at the same time so that we can fulfill our climate ambition that we actually put in law to be climate neutral in 2050. And I think it's again important to dispel the myth that the crisis we are in is because of the transition. And that is a myth, but it has some traction. But actually, if you think about it, the transition has hardly started. And for more food security, for more energy security, for more geopolitical security, and yes, also for more economic security, we need more, not less transition. As I said, we're about to go to COP with Executive Vice President Timmermans, and it's important that we there, it's an implementation COP, and it's important that we engage on legitimate issues of loss and damage. A lot of countries have suffered from climate change that is already happening now, and we have to make sure that we can deal with that. And at the same time, we cannot lose sight of mitigation, because no matter how much you address loss and damage, no matter how much you adapt to existing climate change, if we forget about mitigation, it will only get worse. And I think that's also a very important political message that our bosses tell others, that the greatest swindle talking to those who are most vulnerable is to tell them that they can do the same today, that it's okay, as they did yesterday, and tomorrow will be the same. It's simply not true. And saying that is really, really doing them an injustice. It's not about politics. It's about science, and the IPCC is clear, and I know I'm preaching to the converted right here, but we're reaching tipping points. But except from the science that is impelling us to go there in this transition, there is also a positive proposition, and it's very important that we underline this to people. We're talking about cleaner air. In the EU, at least I speak for the EU, every year 400,000 people die prematurely, and I'm not talking about babies with asthma, because there's too much air pollution. We could do something about it. We could do something about our water, to have fresher water. We can have greener cities. We can have more nature for people to enjoy. We can have less pesticides in our food, which could be healthier. And yes, we can also create new jobs. And with the renewables that are showing how competitive they are, we can ultimately, in the longer term, lower energy prices and keep money in the pocket for those who have need it the most in a competitive and inclusive and circular economy. When it comes to technology, we've got the technology. On the 17th, Executive Vice President will be on the stage in Sharm-el-Sheikh with Bertrand Piccard. You probably know him from Solar Impulse, who's also created this catalog of 1,000 sustainable, commercially viable innovations that need to find their way to the market. But we have a lot of technology. We have the skills and the brains, and there is money. But the challenge is courage for politicians and investors to actually follow suit and go there, make that transition happen, invest where we need to do it. From our vantage point, what we do see is that a lot of big CEOs and big companies are already turning that corner. Business is already going there. And we think that once the market fully internalizes this potential and is convinced that politics is also going there, there's no stopping this transition. As I said, the EU is a trailblazer with the Green Deal. We didn't wait for others. But the good thing is to see that on the other side of the Atlantic, the US came with its Inflation Reduction Act, which was a huge game changer when it comes to the transition in the US. And yes, we'll not hide, we have issues on discriminatory elements of that IRA, and we are in discussion with our partners and allies, and we'll get out of that. But from a climate point of view, it shows that the road of transition is the right road to get on. There will be new jobs in a new economy. And while we cannot stop technological progress simply to save a factory or sector eking out another 5 years of some returns, we will also have to ensure that this transition is just, because otherwise there will be people who will be victim. and we have programs for that. So it's important to understand and realize that not everything can stay the same. And in the history of status quo, of course, status quo has never embraced change. So it is a challenge to keep telling the story why we are doing it, but also how we can do it. I'm reading up on Bretton Woods because, as you know, I'm not a banker. And there's a great book, The Battle of Bretton Woods, the fight between Harry Dexter White and Lord Keynes in 1944. And I think it's exemplary for a bold and forward-looking planning and international cooperation, looking to something they didn't know what would come. The Second World War was still ongoing. And I think we're coming to that point. The world has so much changed compared to 1944. And arguably, we will too have to redefine, update our democracy, our economy, and even our global order to be fit for purpose for a new century and new generations. And the role of banks, an invaluable role in society and economy in any time, but especially now, will be crucial, because there will be no public money enough in the world to do this. No euro, no dollar, no yen. It's just not going to be enough. So what governance can set, whether it's the EU or the US or other countries, is to set regulations at best it can. But ultimately, this transition will have to be driven by the market. And you can catalyze this transition. You can nudge better decisions. You can help channel money to the place where there are the best returns on investment, but also with regard to the best return on external effects that are increasingly being priced in or should be priced in. And ultimately, this is what my boss says also, this is about your children and our children and the many unborn generations that have no voice, whose future we are colonizing if we don't watch out. And their future will depend on how we act now. So it's time to be good ancestors. I know that, as Wim told me, you are already convinced, and that in the banking world, things are moving. And I can only commend you for that. As I said, I'm not a banker, but the truth is we need everyone, every stakeholder to help channel these paradigm shifts and navigate this transition in such a way that we come out better, stronger, greener, more prosperous, but also more free, because those things are on the line. Ultimately, as my boss always says, the existential challenge of climate change and environmental degradation, which are umbilically linked, should transcend politics, domestically and internationally. But also, we're not doing this for the planet. The planet was perfectly fine for 3.5 billion years without us. And if she gets rid of us, she'll be fine afterwards either. We are doing this for the health and well-being and the economic prosperity and the freedom of people, all people, today and in the future. And we're counting on organizations like you to help this transition. There's no time to lose, and we hope you can help here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for being truly inspirational for all of us. And also thank you for the trust and confidence that you have in the banking sector. And that is very kind of you, because indeed, though we clearly and deeply underline the goals that you just outlined, it is, as you say, not always easy in direct contact with your clients, sometimes through lack of data, sometimes through lack of clarity. But it is, as you say, I would say that all the banks that I work with are truly committed, but they are sometimes indeed trying to find. So that's why trying to find new ways. That's why it's so incredibly important that we keep talking together, that there is a clear dialogue ongoing. And we hope that with this side event, we contribute to that, and with our report, we contribute to this dialogue going forward. So thank you very, very much. And I know you have to go, but we will now go into the panel, and I will certainly make sure that the report lands on your desk, and hopefully it's a contribution, but also to Commissioner Timmermans, or please to Vice President Timmermans, please convey our best wishes, but also tell him that if he wants to call on the banking sector for dialogue, for clarification, or maybe for new solutions, we are ready to help.
Thank you. I'll make sure I'll do. And good luck.
Thank you very much. That brings us to our panel, and indeed I am extremely proud with this panel, because the commitment is shown, because we have high-level speakers, and if you see how embedded the work already is in the banking sector, is that most of these people are very senior people that are tasked with executing and implementing the climate arrangements within banks. So I have Hatsina P, who is of Société Générale, the Chief Sustainability Officer of Société Générale, and is a seasoned banker. Why am I so proud of that? Because this is not a separate department. It is key that you have seasoned bankers, seasoned trained people that lead this change. And I'm very happy to have her on board. I have Etienne Barel, the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the French Banking Federation and co-organizer of today's event. He also has a long experience as a banker at BNP Paribas in several countries. So he is also the right person and leading at FBF our sustainability and climate effort. Then I have Jörg Eigendorf, and for Jörg, is the same as Hasina. It shows that Deutsche Bank is also leading by having such a high-level chief sustainability officer who is ready and has long experience, but also experience as a journalist. Because if we go back to what Tony says, we all need to do this together. And this is not only the technicality. We need to, if we want to ensure a just transition, it also means that we need to communicate clearly with our clients and with society. So this is essential as well. And finally, our partner, the partner of Will Road, partner of EY, with whom we have worked together closely on this report, and who has experience in capital market. And as you heard Tony say, there will not be enough public money for this transition. So there's no doubt that banks will play a role, but also investing through capital markets will play an important role. So indeed, as I said, you're at the right place to be here. And I will first turn to Will, if I may, because EY and EBF have made the report, and you were closely involved in the preparation of the report and in the discussion with the banks. Now, to go straight to the core, how do you judge progress of banks since the last COP? And how shall we interpret the current economic and geopolitical circumstances? We talked about it. Is this just short-term noise, or am I saying nonsense and are we not committed anymore? So Will, please.
Thanks, Wim, and it's great to join the panel, and thanks to EBF for the partnership on this publication of the timely report. It was indeed an excellent endeavour that we conducted over the course of the summer period. And as you mentioned earlier, we had a successful response rate to our surveys with 27 banking participants. We also held some great workshops where we got some insights into specific sectors and how those sectors are transitioning, but also just in the course of the ongoing work that we do with our clients since indeed COP last year. I think it's safe to say that we are on a journey. It is a long one, and as Mr. Ogota referred to, we've hardly just started. So to answer your question around how do we measure performance and progress since last year, I think the key is the banking segment has made better progress in understanding the transition pathways for each of the individual sectors, and especially the ways in which they can engage and support their clients on this very long financing journey. That has multiple nuances. Each sector is different. Technologies are at different stages of evolution, and the ability for banks to be able to finance those technologies is really dependent on how mature they are and how at scale they are. It's not necessarily that obvious for a bank that's deploying capital to think through some of these emerging technology solutions that will ultimately need to be financed and brought online to make an effective transition. To answer your question around these recent events and the geopolitical environment, I think banks, from what we've understood, is they always knew this was a long path. So it would have been unrealistic probably for them to assume that nothing was going to happen. That being said, the COVID pandemic was very significant and disruptive event that was completely unanticipated. The recent war in the Ukraine and the subsequent energy crisis coming shortly thereafter has compounded the situation. And now we have a macroeconomic environment where we see inflation and obviously interest rates. So I think the genesis and the thinking behind the report was, how do we think through these events? And to your question, does it in some way change this requirement for this generational transformation? The short story is banks are not reactive in the sense that they invest and divest and flip in and out of positions because they want to generate returns. They have clients that they look to support. They understand this is a long journey. So they're trying to make sensible decisions around how to deploy capital. And they want to support their clients on the transition plan. Their transition plans are determined by science-based targets. This determines the bank's individual net zero pathways and sort of decay curves. And they are looking for financing opportunities that can actually track those emissions calculation that they need to make so that they can fulfill their own net zero commitments. So I hope that somewhat answers the question.
Yes, I feel the same commitment here. And that brings me to Etienne, because Etienne, banks are close to their clients. And that leads to interesting discussions because we're, as banks, not only expected to support the transition to net zero, but we also need to help daily struggling businesses. With the energy crisis, maybe still recovering from loss of income through COVID. And we need to support, I would say, at the macroeconomic level. Governments ask us to strengthen food security and energy resilience. So if you look at the clients and the two things, on one hand supporting them and on the other hand leading to net zero, are they two sides of the same coin or are they conflicting?
Well, they are not at all contradictory. I think that Will very rightly pointed out the fact that it's a long journey, but it's not only long, it's not a linear journey. That is, that we don't change any of our medium-term plans, but we can adapt very shortly to events that are occurring. So if I take the example of this winter, to be just, the transition has to be bearable by the population, by the clients. So we have to finance still the heating of the houses, the power generation, and it implies financing fossil fuel. That's for the very short term. And we acknowledge the fact that this is a journey. But that doesn't change in any way the way forward. And if I take the example of the French banks, all have committed to apply the Net Zero Banking Alliance engagements and commitments. And so after the beginning of the war of Ukraine, they unveiled their transition plans until 2025 or 2030 for the first milestones within this alliance. And if I take the example of the oil and gas sector, they took very ambitious commitments to reduce their exposure, and not only in CO2 emission, but in absolute terms in euro of loans devoted to this sector. So that means that it's not contradictory. And on the contrary, I think it's an opportunity to accelerate the exchange with the clients, because clients are much more aware now of what they need to do to begin very soon and very firmly this journey. And if I take the example of the French banking industry, in 2021, we financed approximately 100 billion of outstanding in green or sustainable loans. And if we take that compared to our balance sheet in oil and gas, it's 143. That is, for 1 euro that we finance in oil and gas, it's 3 or 4 that we finance in green and sustainable loans. and that wouldn't have occurred 1 year ago. So I'm very confident on the fact that figures are here, the commitments are here, and implementation is here in the dialogue with clients.
Thank you. Hasina, Etienne mentions French banks, and I know that you are pushing enormously. Société Générale is one of the founding signatories of the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and asking you lots of questions that I know you can answer from our previous conversations. How does your progress look in practice? How do you do it now as a bank? How do you set the targets and how do you measure progress? Because I know you've been doing a lot of work on that. Can you tell us a little bit how you work?
Yeah, I think that, hi, thanks for the question. I think that like many of our peers, we started with the most emissive sectors, the one with the fair share of CO2 emissions, which are naturally oil and gas and power. I'm leaving coal outside because for us it's past already, it's going down to zero. And so we started with that, of course, using science-based targets. We are aligned on the net zero NZE 2050 scenario. And frankly, on oil and gas, I have to say that we know exactly where we're going, reducing and reducing. On power, it's more, it's a question of intensity. How do you make sure that people will still have access in the world to electricity, but going from a highly carbonated mix to a, well, if possible, almost zero emission mix. And when we did that, we did take into account our possibility to finance Africa, since COP is in Africa, I would like to say that. So we know the mix is going to be different, even though we are going to push for leapfrogs and renewable energy as much as possible. So we did look at different scenarios to accompany our clients everywhere where they are, but with a strong push towards net zero, of course. And it's a challenge, if I may. It's a challenge because, frankly, banks are all committed to NZBA, like, 120 banks almost, and they committed to align their activities to a 1.5 degree scenario. Frankly, the economy is more 2.7, 2.8. So that's a big mathematical challenge. And the easiest for the banks would be to say, okay, I drop my clients, I drop the most emissive activities, and I would, smoothly be on my trajectory for 1.5 degree, but that's not what we're doing. So that's a big challenge.
Exactly. Now, what you say is so important because it is easy to, if you drop all the clients that are slightly brown and don't help them in the transition, as a bank, you may feel that you have 1.5 degree in your books, but we're not doing it for banks, we're doing it for society. And if society doesn't meet the climate goals, then we are not playing our role as banks. So what you highlight very, very clearly is how difficult sometimes the dilemmas are, but also how important it is to keep a clear horizon, but also to be in close dialogue. So Jörg, last year at COP26, financial institutions committed to aligning 130 trillion of private capital with the Paris goals. Today, we are all scrutinized for progress, and that is fine. We're ready to be scrutinized, and Deutsche Bank published its 2030 and 2050 targets. So where are you with these targets? How do you aim to achieve? And do you feel that current circumstances will tip you off target, or are you firmly still aimed at your goal?
No, we are firmly, thank you, Wim, and that's exactly a big question right now, because we see a temporary need for financing in the fossil fuel sector in order to ensure European transformation. But we just published our targets and we didn't change these targets because of this environment. We have an absolute goal for oil and gas. I think this is very important, like Socrates has. And it is very important that we manage this now consequently down. What makes me positive is, and I don't really care, is it 20%, 23%, 30% until 2030. We announced 23%. What is important that we are on this track now. And if I see the processes we have installed and the internal discussions, work stream meetings, everything we did in order to ensure this is just not a target. We know exactly who our top emitters are. We know exactly what kind of business are we doing with them. And if we want to manage it down, we need to make choices eventually, in the sense that we need to bring our clients to pathways. We need to have commitments from them, net zero commitments, and this is a dialogue you need to lead. So we can, by definition, only become net zero if our clients become net zero. I absolutely agree with you. It cannot be about stopping client relationships. Nobody is helped by doing so. What is important in the first instance, right now, is to get into a deep dialogue with the top emitters, what their trajectory is, how we can support them, and how we can get to this new world, and where we manage this down consequently. And then in the second step, we will get a much better feeling who is going on that pathway and who is not. And I think that is the vital question. What is interesting, what we're seeing right now, you make carbon part of your decision-making process. Let's face it, that is a fundamental change, because it's a limit. If you treat carbon eventually like RWA, it's a limit, it's a limitation, and business has to make choices. Business needs to own these targets. And this is what we have been doing. And when I see the discussions we're internally having, then I think it's a tremendous process. What the world is seeing right now outside is our targets of the industry. But I can only imagine, and talking to my colleagues, I have quite a few impressions of what happens in other houses. So you can really see that something is changing fundamentally in the industry.
Yeah, indeed.
Will, may I say something back to Europe?
Yes, Asina, of course.
Because, you just said effectively in your bank and in other banks, things are changing. And you mentioned CO2 as the new scarce resource, where before we looked at RWA, liquidity. That's very true. Internally, we change the way we work, the solutions we push and we design for clients. And the discussions, and we had that exchange already together, the discussions we have with the clients are very different, and they are no more about drawing or repaying or margins. They are about how are you going to be more efficient to produce? Or we talked about the example of shipping, for example. Can you reduce the speed? Can you be smarter in the way you connect with the ship with the harbor, for example, you avoid going fast and then being there, waiting and burning fuel. Banking, industrials, everybody now enters into discussions that were not the usual ones. And so that's why, even though maybe people would think we're not quick enough sometimes, I do think that the revolution has really been engaged on top of targets,
Yeah, and there you say something very, very clear. Indeed, the revolution is in the thinking on every aspect of the value chain, and shipping is a very good example, because if you think about it, still very much diesel generated, but it's not only the ships, it's the whole logistical chain. And maybe whereas in the past we would finance as a bank the ship by itself, maybe now we start rethinking by financing the whole sector in transition.
Exactly.
So I think that is indeed a very, very good addition. Will, if I go back to you, if I go back to the report, what are the key findings of the report? And given your experience and proximity to both the companies and the banks, was there anything surprising, anything that you did not expect?
Yeah, thanks, Wim. So I think we've discussed a little bit already the kind of the contextual table stakes, in as much as firm commitment to net zero, and banks are not changing their approach to that. Obviously, an examination of how these external factors are sort of individually or collectively challenging the approach that banks think about in their own transitioning and ability to support clients, and not really changing risk appetite frameworks or existing policy in any meaningful degree. So the context in terms of findings is sticking to the plan, but within that there's business decisions being made. So what we found in the report is clearly there's overweighting towards particular sectors. Discrete businesses are being able to deploy more capital. The most obvious one, of course, is that energy is I think there were about 50% of respondents were saying they were overweighting that sector in terms of capital allocation. And I think one of the interesting parts of the report, especially in terms of the workshops that we conducted, was the understanding that actually this has been a sector which has been underinvested. So there's a historical situation, at least in the last 5 years, probably because of the heavy focus on renewables. And now in some sense, there's an additional requirement for other types of more traditional energy security needs for financing, as Jorg was mentioning. But this is an and, it's not an or. And where the and comes in is, even if those sorts of projects and activities are being financed, there needs to be a clear transition path. So what is the brown to green pathway, even within the context of financing that kind of activity? So I thought that that was quite interesting in terms of how the ability for banks to make discrete business decisions, even though the overall approach by the firm may not have changed significantly, and then indeed what they're thinking about in terms of how to finance energy security, but with one eye also to the transition agenda still in their sights. I thought that was a key insight. The second thing, which I thought was, if not surprise, well, a comment really, which is to say, ironically or paradoxically, this situation, this very unfortunate situation in the Ukraine and the energy crisis, is it's raising awareness, not just amongst the financial sector, but among citizens and just more broadly. So we go into this winter as individuals highly aware of our own energy consumption behaviors. Typically, and you mentioned, my capital markets background, I see the financial services industry largely influenced or heavily focusing on what are the regulatory requirements. But actually, there's a broader citizens agenda. And in some sense, we could see an acceleration of transition just because of, growing awareness around energy as a sort of a dimension of our own personal lifestyles.
Well, yes, I would see, we see that all around us, and that's again why it's so important, Hasina, because if you look at European companies, and so indeed the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to a shock. As Will said, it made us realize many things, not only our own energy consumption, but also our other dependencies. And for instance, you see European companies with still quite a large level of debt. Nevertheless, they need to invest, even though their investment capacity is limited due to the debt. How are you helping them at SocGen?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And people are scared about the current crisis. They need an emergency response. So we drive them to have a long-term view. And then as banker, we look at the debt capacity, as you pointed out. So, well, there are several things I think there. First, I think that adaptation could be much more costly than any mitigation effort. And so we try to engage in the discussion about, okay, maybe you're a bit stretched right now, but if you don't do that, then it could be a problem, a much bigger problem later to solve. Your costs of running a business could be higher. We see it right now with a lot of companies struggling to pay for utilities in general. But more than that, there could be consequences on the business itself going forward, up to maybe losing your license to operate. When you look now at civil society, when you look at stakeholders, what they expect from us, there is a kind of violence because people are stressed about climate matters. So maybe a company could be boycotted by its clients, by young people not willing to work with them. So you see the cost of not investing right now, even though you're stretched, could be much bigger than we think, not even in monetary terms, I think. And maybe another thing I would like to share is that we tend to think as usual. So I have like brown assets and I need to invest in green assets to replace them, it will be at a big cost. But is it so? Is it not that we need to rethink the way we organize our production? The fact that maybe I see some symbiosis of companies in the circular economy, where the waste of some companies are the inputs of others. So maybe it's not a question of huge capex investments. Maybe it's a question of rethinking a little bit about where you're going. And then for us as a bank, it means inventing a lot of new solutions. Like, for example, switching property for usage. We do a lot more of leasing. We try to work on, okay, if you want to buy some secondhand assets from there, or maybe I buy it from you, and I'm going to lease it to you over a certain period. And then maybe I go a step further and I engage into anything as a service, energy as a service, mobility as a service. So you're right, there's a stress and people tend to freeze and say, wow, I'm not going to invest. And maybe we tend to think, is it bankable today? But it's our duty to think a little bit more further and invent these solutions. And just to finish, if you take just a simple example of a thermal car versus an electrical one, today the electrical one costs more. But when you look at maintenance, when you look at the cost of electricity going forward compared to fuel, over the whole usage of the car, maybe it's not that expensive. So that's a bit my reflection, that maybe we need to avoid thinking as usual, all things being equal.
Asina, this is exactly, I think, you are spot on, because extremists like going from brown to green, that leads to all sorts of extreme reactions, and people then freeze in their decision because they only see the cost, as you say. But there are so many smart solutions, and what you say actually is that this is where banks can help. We need to help our clients on a transition plan, and we need to be ready to look differently at finance. Indeed, you say ownership and credit may be replaced by leasing, or indeed selling commodities as a service. So indeed, this is very much the smart way of being in dialogue. Again, that brings me also to Jörg. Jörg, if I want to ask you, it is so important that you're close to your clients and that you're in constant discussion, and also that your clients are not only coming to their bank once they have made the final decision and need financing, but they are indeed, they integrate the bank as part of the transition. So is there enough awareness among your clients of this process and how important it is to take their bank along in the discussion on the transition? So how do you engage with your clients?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, because part of the clients have absolutely the awareness. I mean, if you look at, and this is interesting, I said before that we made carbon part of our decision-making process, then the first thing you need to do is, where are your biggest emitters? And the issue with the corporates is you have a high concentration, a very high concentration. 1% of our corporate clients make more than 50% of our financed emissions. So then it's very clear you need to be in the dialogue with these clients. And then you have those clients who have committed already to a net zero pathway. There you run through open doors. Then you have the clients who really try to, and they need help. They need support. How can we develop this? Where can we help you also? And then you have those clients who may neglect, but they are very, very few. I mean, you also see that the clients without targets, so you need to get them to a target setting. And these are very interesting conversations, because, for example, I lately talked to one CFO who was kind of resistant to these things, big industrial company. And the interesting thing is, eventually we came, and it was a long dialogue and a conversation, and we came to the point is that he complained about his capital cost being higher because of all these environmental issues, which is a very clear thing. And there you have then touch points where you can really go into, we can help you, we can support you, and also translate this for the market. And this is something we really need to do for our clients. So There is a pressure point if you have business coverage people who have then to think about carbon as a decision-making factor. You have clients that changes their relationship, or they need to be in touch. I see it more as an opportunity than a curse.
Yeah.
You have a great opportunity to go into these dialogues, and you have a great opportunity to really analyze it. And with one client, we made a huge list of fact-checking things, because there's so much in the public sphere which you first need to fact-check, where you need to carve out the transition plan, where you need to develop a good thinking and a good narrative behind that transition plan. Because I would what Tony Agota said before, we need to explain it much better. We need to be able to explain it to the market too. So there is enough for us. If you always think about sticks and carrots, we have sticks, but much more important is a carrot, also in the dialogue, and to convince the people. That's, by the way, with corporates. And I just want to point a little bit to the bigger issue also with, to make it transparent to everybody. The other thing is we have a huge mortgage loan portfolio in Germany. I assume that SocGen has the same. In France, these are more than 1 million clients. These are almost 2 million contracts. Now, the fact is 80% of the German real estate has been built before 1980. That needs to be transformed. So if anybody asks us now, what is your lever here? Are you going to kick out these clients? I mean, nobody can mean that seriously, that we are not even allowed by law to do that. So we now have to think about, and this is much bigger work, by the way, than thinking about a couple of hundred big emitting clients. It's about thinking of millions of homeowners we have to bring to the net zero world. By definition, if Germany wants to be net zero by 2045, the real estate sector makes up some 30% of the carbon emissions. So how are we going to tackle that issue? What are we going to do on that pathway? And we, by definition, can only be net zero if our clients are net zero. So it's our vested interest to support them here. And again, there are a lot of processes behind it. And we need to think smart about the opportunity, because in banking, as you know, when you are a banker, and everybody who is a banker and has been working in a bank for quite some time, you need to have a carrot, you need to put it in numbers, you need to incentivize people, and they choose to use that opportunity. That's the big challenge, and to do it in a smart way and in a quick way. And we embarked on that journey, and I think that has been it's a very good one.
Well, indeed, now to add a personal note, if you talk indeed about the whole mortgage market, if you think about houses built before 1980, and I personally live in a house built in 1928, I've done most of the measures possible, and still I'm not satisfied with the result that I get, even after isolation, changing heating, changing lighting, etc. If you just think about old cities like Rome, like Paris, the old cities of Europe, that it will be a huge challenge. And you're right, we need to help our clients to get there. But also data and comparability are essential. So Etienne, I know that many banks joined the Net Zero Banking Alliance because of the need of the common language and the common methodology, not only in Europe, but also between other parts of the world. And for our engagement with clients, because you can only help if you have the right data and the right methodology. You still see that different sectors, different factors may be committed to the goal, but they use proprietary technology, they go their own way, and that is not comparable. So the French Banking Federation is doing a lot to help banks implement the Net Zero Banking Alliance commitments. Can you explain how you do that? How does the French Banking Federation facilitate the process?
Well, I'll try to do that, but we must be very modest. We did not invent anything, because our goal was just to have a look at the landscape and to see in American banks, UK banks, German banks, Spanish banks, what was used and what could be the best in class. And so really the idea was not to build up the perfect French method that nobody else would use, but what could be some common principle, some common approach that could be used by every French bank in order to facilitate the dialogue with the clients. So French client doesn't have to comply with one method for one bank with another set of KPI with another bank and so on. And also to be very ambitious within the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is not prescriptive method relating. And so to set standards that could be at a high level for the whole party within NZBA. So to be very concrete, we define, for instance, what kind of scenario we use for power generation, what kind of scope we use. Is it only the banking book, banking plus trading book? Do you have also your capital markets activities and so on? How do you account for multiple accounts on scope 3? Do you use proxies? Do you use client data? What kind of data provider you use? These kind of very practical things. So we tried with our banks to set up those common principles, and we agreed upon them. So we think that this is hopefully a useful step forward in order to set up both a pragmatic approach, because it's not a new method, but also an ambitious approach in order to comply with those NZBA commitments.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And indeed, that's one of the strengths of the NZBA is that the work that you do in France, what works, you share through the whole network. And so it's the sharing of best practices, everybody, that makes people curious, that makes people inspiring, and that's how we solve problems. So I think the work that you do is excellent. So I'm almost at the end, but I have one question, and to be honest, it sounds like a simple question, but it isn't. I've been listening to you and I've been working with you for some time, so I've heard it already. But I will ask all of you to say in 2 sentences what you feel that at this stage success will depend on. What should come out of COP27? What will success depend on? And listening carefully to you, I've heard it in your longer statements, but it is beautiful to summarize at the end of our seminar. So if I may start with Jörg.
Yes, to unmute. I think we need the commitment also from the industry, and I think it's important if we stay a little more focused. I don't want to talk about the big wide world right now. We as an industry need to stay together.
Yep.
I think this is very important. What we see right now, all these NZBA discussions and all of that, it is much easier for all of us to climb up a mountain when there is not some party going on in the valley and everybody we try to take up on the mountain is saying, hey, you take up on this snowy mountain, it's cold up here, and have you seen the party down there? And you have to tell the people, yeah, but these are laggards. They will have to climb up the mountain too. It will be tremendously helpful if we don't have to have these internal discussions. If everybody needs to climb that mountain by their own means, by their own ways, competing with each other, competing for our clients, but we need these standards and we need these common data, we need these common approaches. And that's why the NZBA for me is a big success. And all these discussions we are hearing right now are not a surprise, but it is dangerous if this falls apart, because then it won't be a level playing field and others will point to the valley and say, look, this party, and we want to join this party again.
Well, that's very nicely said. And you can imagine that for me as CEO of the European Banking Federation, if there's one thing I believe in is sticking together. And I must say in the membership, we have no doubt nobody stays around and down in the valley. They're all indeed in their own tempo going up the hill, but it is good to always remember how important that is that we go up the hill together. Thank you very much. Hasina, success. What's success?
Yeah, to be fair, if I had one thing, I would say like my colleague Jörg, cooperation and co-construction. Now I'll tell you my second one, which is as important, reintegrate long-term in the strategic decision making, I think. You know, Tony Aguta said something, I don't know if everybody got it. He said, you need to be good ancestors. is referring to an excellent book, The Good Ancestor, which teaches us how to reintegrate long-term, and it's not an easy one. And he even says in this book that Iroquois Indians, when they took a decision, they would think about the consequences of this decision up to the 7th generation.
Yeah.
Not just your kids or grandkids. And that's about nature. That's about the equilibrium of society. That, you see? So maybe we cannot fight against, the short-termism of our listed company societies for a 7th generation, but still a bit of long-term view would be helpful for success.
That is beautifully said, and indeed, I very much know the book, and I found it very inspiring that if you think ahead for the 7th generation, it immediately puts any decision in a different light. So it takes away from the short-term gain. So I think that's a very important message to be very conscious of in everything we do. Will?
I think the simple point that everyone has understood, given just the sheer cost, is we can't have a sustainable world or future without sustainable finance. So everything that's been said in terms of the collective effort towards that understanding is very clear. I think in terms of when we think about mobilization of capital, obviously a lot of the way in which we spend our time, and I think how banks, but also just more broadly within financial services, all types of financial industry participants are thinking about is, what is the effective means by which I can deploy capital into a sustainable future? And I think those constructs are in development, and the ways in which all types of financial service providers across banks, investment managers, private equity, even the wealth segment, thinks about how to mobilize that capital effectively is key. I think the second thing, as sort of a part of that, is this is a business decision in many respects. So obviously understanding, I think we've talked quite a bit around being able to support clients, but within that, deep sector expertise, and Asina was mentioning earlier, things about how to talk with clients with your deep sector understanding in terms of that individual industrial change program, understanding that. So whether that's change of use or retrofits or how to scale new technologies will be key. I think it's really understanding this has now become core to the business itself.
Absolutely. Etienne?
Well, I think that the key word is alignment. Alignment between ourselves, and I see a lot of collaboration, and I see it as a federation. It's a competitive matter, and we don't have to be naive on that. There is a competition between banks on that, and that's good to be very ambitious for each of one. But the collaboration part is very important, and that's the first point. The second is alignment outside our financial world. Our alignment with the clients, alignment with public authorities, alignment with NGOs. And here we still have progresses to make, because I think that in order to be inclusive, we have to convince everyone that we are here to help them and to help the society making this transition.
Absolutely, and that is almost a perfect conclusion, Etienne, because we come now at the end of our short seminar and our panel, and if I see is banks are no doubt as committed as they ever were to COP27 and the goals. It is clear that there were great events in the world in the past year, but they are seen as short-term events and they will not take us away from the final goal. So what is needed is alignment, not only among banks and collaboration, even in a competitive environment, but also with society, civil society, NGOs and others. Because the only way we can reach the goals and the important goals and mitigate the effects of climate change and hopefully stop is by working closely together and being serious. I highly recommend the report that we made, but we are truly constantly committed to the road to net zero. Thank you very much to the audience, and thank you very much for my panelist, Antonia Gotta. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.